Inside Pelican Bay, true prison crime documentary. The Whisper in the Yard. The night air around Crescent City was heavy with fog, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred outlines into ghostly shapes. Beyond the mist, rising like a fortress from the Northern California coast, stood Pelican Bay State Prison, a name that carried weight in every courtroom, every street corner where gang soldiers traded whispers of who was inside. It wasn't just a prison, it was the end of the line. Men sent here were too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too loyal to gangs to be trusted anywhere else. Inside its walls, the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, was where silence lived. Concrete cells, 8 by 10 windowless, where inmates spent 23 hours a day locked inside, their only glimpse of the world coming through a slit in the steel door. It was designed to break men. But in late autumn of 1996, the SHU became the stage for a crime so bold it shook the prison system to its foundations. It started with a body. In the early hours of a routine morning, guards doing their rounds found inmate Manuel Ortega lying motionless in the exercise yard, face down in the damp concrete. At first glance, it looked like another overdose. Smuggling drugs into Pelican Bay was as common as contraband tattoos, and Ortega was known to deal for one of the prison's most feared gangs, the Nuestra Familia. But when the guards rolled him over, the truth was different. His chest was punctured with 3 precise wounds angled upward, like strikes from a blade no longer than a sharpened toothbrush. The investigation began immediately. Pelican Bay was a world where every murder was a message, and Ortega's death couldn't be dismissed as routine prison violence. Lieutenant Richard Hanley, a man with 20 years in corrections, stood over the crime scene and knew instantly what it meant. Someone had breached the unbreachable. Weapons inside the SHU were supposed to be impossible. Ortega had been stabbed in an area under 24-hour surveillance. That meant either someone inside the system had helped, or someone had outsmarted it. The suspect list was endless. Ortega had enemies in the Aryan Brotherhood, rivals in the Mexican Mafia, and even men in his own gang who saw him as a liability. But what rattled Hanley most wasn't the fact Ortega was dead, it was what they found in Ortega's pocket. Folded tightly into a plastic wrap was a note written in jagged handwriting, "The yard belongs to no one." The words echoed through the prison like a gunshot. To gang investigators, it was the equivalent of declaring war. But no one signed it, and in a place where signatures meant everything, the mystery was worse than the message itself. Detectives from Del Norte County Sheriff's Department were brought in, alongside the prison's Internal Security Investigations Unit. They combed through Ortega's cell, his associates, his debts. Every clue pointed in a different direction. Ortega owed gambling money to the Black Guerrilla family. He'd been caught smuggling letters for the Mexican Mafia. And he'd been seen arguing with his own shot caller just days before his death. But then came the twist. 2 days into the investigation, an officer conducting random searches in another block stumbled across something hidden inside the vent of an abandoned cell. It was a bundle wrapped in plastic, smeared with soap to mask the scent from dogs. Inside were 3 things: a sharpened metal shank still spotted with blood, a folded deck of playing cards, and a torn half of a photograph showing Ortega with 3 other inmates, faces blurred by age but one detail unmistakable. On the arm of one of the men was a tattoo, half a sun with rays pointing upward. The mark of the Aryan Brotherhood. The investigators thought they had their lead. But the problem was bigger. The man in the photograph wasn't even in Pelican Bay anymore. He'd been transferred months earlier to Folsom. Which raised a chilling question. Why was Ortega's death tied to men who weren't even there? And how had a bloody shank, the murder weapon itself, ended up hidden in a cell that hadn't been occupied for weeks? Rumors spread fast among the inmates. Some said Ortega had been an informant. Others whispered that someone inside the prison staff was feeding weapons and staging the scene. In Pelican Bay, truth and lies were currency and everyone was trading. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of surveillance footage. Reviewing grainy tapes from the SHU's cameras, investigators noticed a shadowy figure passing through a blind spot just minutes before Ortega was found. The man walked with a limp, dragging his right foot. Guards swore it was inmate Jorge "Cricket" Ramirez, a Mexican mafia enforcer with a reputation for creative violence. But when they questioned him, Ramirez only smiled, leaned back in his chair and said, "If I wanted Ortega dead, I'd leave my name on it." The arrogance was infuriating. Yet Ramirez had an alibi. 3 other inmates swore he was locked in his cell at the time. The footage was too grainy to confirm otherwise. What should have been the smoking gun became another dead end. And then, just as investigators started to believe the case might stall, came the discovery that changed everything. While searching Ortega's cell again, An officer lifted the thin mattress and found a small hollow space carved into the steel frame. Inside was a stack of letters written in code. Pages filled with numbers and symbols, the kind used by prison gangs to communicate orders. But one line, translated by gang experts, stood out: "The warden bleeds next." The room went silent. Investigators stared at the words and realized the murder of Ortega wasn't just about settling a score. It was the first move in something much bigger. Something that reached beyond the inmates and into the very heart of Pelican Bay itself. And when they decoded the rest of the letter, the truth hit like a hammer. Because the orders didn't come from anyone inside the prison. They came from outside, signed with the mark of a man who was supposed to be serving a life sentence in another state entirely. Blood on the concrete. The letters changed everything. The coded words hinted at an invisible hand guiding Ortega's death. A man whose name still made hardened criminals sit straighter in their cells. Victor L. Jeff Morales. Morales was the kind of legend whispered in every California prison. A founder of the Mexican Mafia, sentenced to life without parole after orchestrating murders from San Quentin in the early 80s. Officially, he was locked away in a Colorado supermax. Unofficially, his orders still reached California like a shadow no wall could block. How could a man hundreds of miles away sign Ortega's death warrant? And why was Pelican Bay, the state's most fortified prison, suddenly trembling under his command? Investigators pushed harder. Surveillance was doubled. Cells were flipped, mail intercepted. But with every day that passed, Ortega's murder rippled through the yard. Alliances shifted like sand. The Aryan Brotherhood stopped trading with Nuestra Familia. Black guerrilla family lieutenants pulled their soldiers back into tighter ranks. Everyone expected the next strike, and no one knew where it would land. Then the violence began. It started small. A guard found beaten unconscious in a stairwell, his keys missing. Hours later, the entire C-yard went into lockdown after inmates from two rival gangs staged a brawl that left 3 stabbed and 1 dead. But these weren't random eruptions. Each incident happened in places where cameras were blind, where patrols were thinnest. Someone was orchestrating chaos with military precision. Lieutenant Hanley felt it tightening around him. He'd seen prison wars before, but never this level of coordination. And then came the discovery that confirmed his fears. One of the prison's own staff was dirty. An officer named Harold Denton, a 10-year veteran with a clean record, was caught trying to sneak a sealed envelope past security. Inside were coded instructions, identical to the ones found in Ortega's cell. Denton swore he was being threatened, that Morales's people had his family under watch. Whether it was fear or loyalty didn't matter. The breach proved Pelican Bay's walls weren't as solid as everyone believed. And the orders were clear: destabilize, distract, prepare for blood. The climax came one storm-soaked night in November. At 2:14 a.m., alarms shrieked across the prison. Inmates in the SHU had staged a coordinated uprising, somehow jamming their locks and flooding the corridors. Guards rushed in only to find Molotov cocktails fashioned from soap bottles exploding against the walls. How those bottles got inside, no one could answer. In the chaos, a group of masked inmates cornered a guard in the control room. The message was clear: you can lock us down, you can bury us in cells, but you can't silence the streets. El Jeef runs this yard. By dawn, the prison was under military occupation. Tactical teams swept the blocks, finding hidden caches of weapons and coded notes in cell after cell. The entire SHU was stripped bare. Over 100 inmates were transferred to different facilities. The uprising was crushed, at least on paper. But something deeper had been exposed. Ortega's murder had been the spark in a war that didn't end at Pelican Bay's gates. The final twist came weeks later, in a sealed envelope delivered to Del Norte Sheriff's Department. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed Ortega, alive. The date on the back was 1 day before his supposed murder. In the picture, he sat at a table in a cell that wasn't Pelican Bay's. Next to him was a man no one expected. Harold Denton, the prison guard who'd been arrested. The message was unmistakable. Ortega's death was staged. The body in the yard wasn't Ortega's at all. It was a decoy, a man sacrificed to send a message. Ortega had vanished, pulled from the prison under the very noses of the investigators. Some said he became an informant for the feds, hidden in witness protection. Others swore he was smuggled out by Morales's men to serve a darker purpose. To this day, no one knows for certain. But Pelican Bay never recovered. The murder that wasn't a murder revealed the fragility of the system, the power of men whose reach extended beyond steel doors and concrete walls. And for every officer who walked those corridors, the thought lingered: If Ortega could vanish, if Morales could bend Pelican Bay to his will from a cell states away, then the prison wasn't the end of the line. It was only the beginning. Because in places like Pelican Bay, the real crime wasn't always what happened inside. It was what those walls were built to hide.